Hey there, Hour of History podcast fans. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we are turning our watches back a bit further than we normally do. We're going back to the Anglo-Saxons, and we're going to figure out how the Anglo-Saxons formed their identity, how they fought off Vikings, and how they told awesome stories with riddles. This is just some of the stuff that Dr. Courtnay Konshuh works on. She has some fascinating stories. We're going to cover people like Alfred the Great and a whole bunch of other things. It'll be really insightful for you, especially if you are a fan of modern history. I know I learned a lot during the episode, and it is going to lead you to some great new outlets and interesting things to check out so you can seem smarter than all of your friends when you're watching TV series like Vikings. Or don't watch them and just enjoy it all. There's some great suggestions at hourofhistory.com/recs, R-E-C-S. There's some excellent links on the show notes at hourofhistory.com. And finally, please do subscribe at hourofhistory.com/subscribe. You guessed it. So you get the weekly episode updates to your email, and you can absolutely subscribe on those podcast syndicates as well. Well, I've spoken enough for the intro. It's an excellent conversation. Once again, thanks for listening to Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world, anytime, any place.
With your host, Stephen Bauman, and producer, James Albel. The Hour of History is a member of Episodic Network, an association of fun, interesting, and informative podcasts. EpisodicNetwork.com. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I have with me Dr. Courtnay Konshuh, who is an expert on a very cool topic. It's great to have you with us, Courtnay.
Thanks.
So now you study a topic that I would say is not so widespread. It must get really old, always having to sort of explain the very basics to everyone, does it?
Yeah, I guess a bit. I mean, when you say early medieval history, that doesn't really mean anything to most people. But if I start talking about Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, then that usually helps. People know that from all the television shows that you have now.
And people's eyes kind of light up when you say Anglo-Saxons and Vikings and things like that?
Yeah, I guess they imagine it's going to be more fun than it is.
Well, it must have been fun because, I mean, you decided to earn your doctorate in studying it. What can you take us through that? What is your background in this area? And what possesses someone to go pursue and earn a doctorate in this area, become, an expert?
Well, it was random chance for me. I was doing an MA in Germany, and it wasn't my native language, so I decided to do a minor in something English just to make it a little bit easier for me, and ended up taking English medieval literature and language. And so I learned Old English language and Middle English, and, well, especially Old English. I just love the language. I like the poetry. I like the way they do history writing. It's just very beautiful. So it's really because of the language that I got into the history of it. My major was history, so then it was natural to just move into Anglo-Saxon history after the MA.
And do you remember, was there a first sort of poem or a first sort of book that really brought you into it?
Yeah, there's this poem called The Battle of Brunanburg. It's commemorates a battle in the year 937 between some allied Anglo-Saxon forces, West Saxons and Mercians and East Anglians, against a bunch of Vikings coming from Dublin and York and some Scots.
Wow. And and even that must take a very high level of literacy, right? It's not something you just jump into. Were you a voracious reader at a younger age?
Yeah, I've always loved reading.
And so that kind of one thing led to another?
I guess. I mean, it's very... Most of the poetic Anglo-Saxon literature is about heroes and battles and really quite exciting topics. So it's easy to get into that way. But language is so poetic and metaphoric that it's really beautiful and challenging to follow.
Would you say people have a perception that it's more intimidating than it actually is? Or
Possibly. I think they underestimate it mostly. Usually when I tell people that I had to learn Old English, they say, oh, that's what Shakespeare was speaking.
and
and it's quite a bit harder than that.
Yeah, and it's from even looking at the names of Anglo-Saxon kings, you get a sense that it's exactly much more complicated than that. Now, when you're studying a language that isn't spoken anymore, how do you go about doing that?
Well, mostly German linguists from the late 19th century have worked it all out for us. So there are lots of pronunciation guides that, well, you can reconstruct how the pronunciation might have been by looking at the ways that language branches, language families develop over time. So if you look at the modern Germanic languages like German and the Norwegian and English, then you can trace each of them back to a stage where they were closer to each other and guess or estimate, I guess, what sounds turn into what other sounds. So from that, you can tell like that the H in Old English is usually a sound or a sound.
Mm-hmm. So you're not only doing like sort of artistic literary work, but also historical and linguistic work.
Well, this is the fun part about a period like Anglo-Saxon England, where you have so few remaining historical sources. You can't just read the history texts because you could finish them all in a couple of weeks. So you've got to read the poetry and see it as a historical record, and see random stone carvings or jewelry as part of the historic record. You've got to look at all of it, including the language. And
now language and writing then becomes the focus for most historians in this area. But I'll be honest with you, most history departments I've been in and my experience as a student in history, we haven't started early. You know, the teachers kind of say, the professors say, there was the Dark Ages or whatever, let's start at the Renaissance. Where does it fit in? What is your argument of the place of sort of Anglo-Saxons? Where should we study them?
Why do we need it, do you mean?
Well, kind of like where do they belong? Maybe before, I always get so jaded with that question, why do we need it? Because I think we can find value in sort of a lot of subjects, but where should it be? Because, you know, teaching in New York City, there was sort of like a ancient history things that you had to learn, like Mesopotamia and things like that, and then the new modern world history sort of starts at 1750. That's the year they decided. Mm-hmm. So a lot is left out, and students would often ask, like, well, you know, I want to learn about this stuff that I'm seeing on TV, but where does it fit in?
So I guess part of what's really exciting about watching the Anglo-Saxon world develop is from the late 9th to the 10th century, there isn't really one coherent state, and it becomes a state sort of by the end of the 10th century. Wessex expands and conquers a bunch of other smaller kingdoms. And what you can look at in that period is all of the efforts that kings from the southern part used in order to convince everybody else that actually we are all English. This is a unit, it should be called England, and you should all be led by me. So it's identity politics that is in the poetry and sometimes in the language and definitely in the history. And that's definitely relevant today.
Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely fascinating. I just taught a course on nationalism a couple moons ago. And I hadn't even considered, well, I obviously considered where I should start the course, but it was always it had to be a modern history course just because of the stipulations of my knowledge base and things like that. But that's fascinating. So there's a huge issue of identity politics here. Could you explain a little bit more about like things like borders and how that kind of stuff shifted?
Yeah, so I guess what my research has so far looked at, or what I find to be the most interesting aspect of this identity politics, is when the Vikings are invading across the 9th century, right? Mm-hmm. At first, they're not a very big threat, but then the armies are getting bigger, and eventually it seems that they're bent on total conquest. This is the time when writings coming from the West Saxon court, that's the kingdom that eventually is dominant, they really work on presenting the Vikings as sort of subhuman. They describe them as tricksters. They're not honorable in battle. They sneak away at night in order to avoid a fight if they can. They use information so that they can show up where they'd be least expected or when the kingdom is already in turmoil, and they make peace treaties that they break, and they steal food all the time. And they're really quite othered throughout these texts. And that's what helps create this dichotomy of us versus them. That's where you can get we Anglo-Saxons are all a unit as opposed to the Vikings.
And is this sort of like a, the argument that writing is leading towards nationalism, the imagined communities type thing? Because that's, Anderson's arguing that it's a printed press, but this is pre all of that.
Yeah, well, I see these mechanisms of control in pretty much every society, right? And the written word is extremely powerful. I mean, the printing press is great, but if you don't have that, that's actually the main thing that comes out of King Alfred's court, the one who beats off the Vikings in the 870s, is that he creates a scholarly court after Charlemagne's model. And they start churning out not just translations, but original texts, legal codes, the history text, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which seems to be some sort of nation-making document. I don't really see it as, or I wouldn't use the term nationalism for that early. I would say more it's identity formation.
And so Alfred the Great, right? He gets that moniker, I guess. So what are some of the things he does to build the identity?
So he instructs his scholarly court, his biographer Asser tells us this, that they need to translate all the things in the kingdom that are important. And one of the letters in the prefaces to one of these books, he says that Latin learning was so dilapidated after all of these Viking assaults and their depredations of the monasteries. So a couple of books are translated really early, and they're generally about being a good moral being, like Pope Gregory the Great's dialogues are translated, and Pastoral Care, and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. But in all of these texts and a couple others, they're not, his court doesn't translate them very carefully, like they're not word for word translations. They're embedded with different ideas about kingship and rulership and identity. And that really suggests a strong central king who's backed by God, who has sort of a divine right to rule. So that's all pointing towards this centralization of authority. But I think writing down the laws and creating a chronicle for the Anglo-Saxon world that starts at zero or with Caesar's conquest of Britannia, I think that's what really worked to create this identity.
So there's a connection back there then to this time, right? That people find interesting, or that, as firm identity-wise, I guess. Yeah. But now, that I have a lot of questions about that. I'll start maybe with how you have these documents. These are top level documents, and how many people are we talking about? And what is how do you sort of get to the thought of the regular person? What is a regular Anglo-Saxon life like? What are they doing?
Very good and pretty short.
Yeah. No, it's an hour of history.
I mean, their lives wouldn't have been all that great for an average person, and the average person couldn't read, of course, so they wouldn't have been able to read messages being sent across the country. But how they would have gotten these messages is by coinage, because the coinage would always have some sort of message on it, either an image of the king or something that he thought was important. Alfred printed a coin that has a monogram of London when he recaptured London. It's really difficult to pick apart. So that's good advertising. And Also, you would expect, I guess, a lot of these ideas to be transmitted via the monasteries, and people there who could read would then tell these stories. I expect that a lot would have been passed on by word of mouth. And because Old English poetry is alliterative, it's reasonably easy to remember, so it could transfer that way. Alfred's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was created with a totally new style of Old English. There hadn't been a lot of Old English prose writing before then. If you wanted to be a good writer, you'd write in Latin, of course. But the way that the Chronicle is written, it uses sort of semi-formulaic looking language, so it's definitely prose, but because the language sometimes rhymes and formulas repeat themselves, that would also be a message that could fairly easily be remembered and passed on.
And are these, what is the breakdown of society? Because it sounds like there's a few people who are literate, or at least a couple who have to really devote their life to this. And then are most of the other people just trying to survive through agriculture and things like that?
Yeah, pretty much. So we imagine that monks especially would have been able to read. Hardly any of the elites would have been able to read. Alfred's biographer says that he learned how to read, but there's no direct evidence for that. And there is a lord, an ealdorman, in about 100 years later who definitely learned Latin, and he made a Latin translation of an Anglo-Saxon chronicle for his cousin on the continent. But yeah, regular people you would expect couldn't read at all. And there are some towns in the 9th and 10th century. There are lots of towns, but I would imagine most of life would be agricultural.
And so these biographers become really powerful people then. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you've only got a couple of sources for a 50-year period, then...
And now is the biographer a role that one is born into? Are they part of the royal family, or how do they get to where they are?
So Asser came from Wales, and Alfred pretty much begged him to join his scholarly court. I don't know how he got the job. I mean, he must have taken it upon himself. The biography looks like it's unfinished as well. We've lost the only original copy of it, but we have a 16th century copy that someone made before the original burnt.
Oh.
In a very tragic manuscript fire at Ashburnham in England in 1731, where we lost a lot of things.
Oh, no. And I thought losing my keys was bad. So, wow. So, okay, now I mean, I've been holding off, and I think I've done a pretty good job. We have to eventually get into like sort of the popular culture question of all this.
All right.
With the resurgence of like Game of Thrones, and Amazon has its Vikings or whatever, what do you see in this representation? Are there historians behind the scenes kind of pointing people in the right direction, or are these sort of films that totally fantasy?
I mean, my understanding from working with somebody who advised on The Last Kingdom is that the plot is already established, the setting is probably already chosen, and some of the expensive materials are already purchased as well. Then they hire a historian, and you have to maneuver within the boundaries of what they've already established, which sounds like it can be really frustrating at times, but sometimes it's really easy to slip very accurate things in.
So they might like ask the historian, so what kind of sword would they have used for this type thing?
Yeah. So like little details like that. But at the same time, they already have, like, everybody is outfitted in furs with ginormous axes, which is completely implausible.
So seeing those kind of things, that must be interesting. Have you also noticed like more engagement from students and that sort of thing in medieval work or in Anglo-Saxons?
Yeah, absolutely. It's risen a lot since then. A lot of the people who used to study medieval studies, they read Tolkien or something, fantasy books as a kid. But now there's a whole bunch of other series as well. A lot of these tutor series, people can't necessarily tell the difference between late medieval and early modern. Whatever, it all leads you in the same direction. If you come to study medieval history as a result, then I'm happy about it.
Yeah, and the art too. So my first exposure to this was in just an art history class, and we would look at the illuminated manuscripts and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I just remember it all being so just so foreign and so different to me. Yet people still, we see Anglo-Saxon in modern day language. How has that sort of identity survived? Is that something that you trace?
How supposed Anglo-Saxon identity exists in the modern day, you mean?
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Only in a skeptical, angry kind of way.
Please do tell.
Well, I mean, identity is generally something that's created, and this idea that that's a pure real thing. Well, it was created by Alfred, and then people started to believe in it. And 1,000 years later, when everybody's been moving around, that's not a thing.
I once had someone tell me that they were a Phoenician.
Yeah, or people who tell me that they're actually Vikings. You're not a Viking.
So how that's a big struggle, right? Working with identity. I imagine you have you have to set a lot of time aside, at least, to think of that. Would people just switch sides if there was a battle that was going to benefit them?
Yeah, we know of quite a few generals, especially around 1000 when Canute was attacking, who would just switch sides. It's a bit of a difficult place anyway when you've got Anglo-Saxons and Old Norse speakers living alongside each other, and the languages are really close to each other. It's maybe like Spanish and Portuguese. They would be mutually intelligible. Mm. So if you grow up in that context, then you probably grow up very bilingual and able to move back and forth pretty easily. Yeah, there's one Ealdorman, Edrich, who during Ethelred's reign goes back and forth between Ethelred's and the Vikings' sides 3 or 4 times.
And it's hard. I don't know. It's hard for me to sort of comprehend, what is the word? Sort of how changeable, how permeable these things were. Maybe I'm guilty of being a presentist, where we have such fixed conceptions, and I'm always trying to show students the map and kind of say, the lines don't always fall exactly where they do. But that seems like a kind of extreme, switching sides that many times. Were they were that close?
Yeah, within about 5 years. I don't know if that's a lack of identity, though. I think that's just
yeah, opportunism, wanting to win. Yeah, so, go on.
Right?
You can go on.
Are you American?
Well, see, it's funny because I go and play at Irish sessions, and this guy the best people come up and just say comments. Mm-hmm. And someone came up and said, "Are you Irish?" to all of us playing there, and we just all kind of looked at each other and none of us really we're not Irish. That's for certain, but everyone has a grandpa or something or an interest. And then finally someone said, "No, but we like Irish music." But yeah, that kind of exposes it, the identity thing. But I certainly say, I feel like people are much closer to their identity in the present day. Is that true, or would you say that's false?
I think that's looking back at it and just imagining that life in society wasn't as refined, or couldn't think as well back then as they do now. I think that we all have a lot of very different identities, and they're all changing over time depending on if you move, or your job, or your circle of friends. If you think about your own identity and what it means to be your nationality, if that's changed in your head in the last 10 years or 20 years. It probably has, and you maybe haven't noticed it changing, but I think stuff like that is just going on all the time. You're constantly defining yourself in relation to your surroundings and changing circumstances.
Now, you've dedicated years of your life to studying this. Do you find yourself falling into that sort of trap even still that I just fell into, where we're kind of evaluating people from the past unfairly or not on the same yeah.
I mean, I was reading a bunch of miracle stories with my students, and they were bringing some bones back for a new church during Charlemagne's reign, and all these wonderful things happened, like blind people started to see again, and sick people became well, and various things. People came out of comas, and my students thought, well, this is obviously all lying, and I couldn't figure out. I know that the author isn't just lying. That doesn't make any sense. He wouldn't do that. But I couldn't figure out exactly what would actually be going on there in order to tell my students, no, it's not a lie. And I had a psychologist in the classroom started talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and the kind of illnesses that can cause, especially a lot of psychosomatic things apparently, and that having a confrontation with the divine or a religious experience can shock you out of those. And all of these people with all of these illnesses in places where there had been warfare, uninterrupted for 40 years, were probably severely traumatized, and that's what leads these things to happen, and that's how it's been recorded then, or that's how it was understood at the time. And yeah, I mean, I don't believe in miracles, and I don't think it's really a clever thing to do to believe in miracles now, but when I look back 1,000 years ago, it was a rational, normal thing. I have to be careful with stuff like that.
Yeah. Were they? Was there drug use back then too?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So is that a potential?
Possibly, but miracles are really, really widespread.
So
things people couldn't explain.
And what about the senses? Like, I imagine, to kind of reverse the sort of way we're talking about it, I imagine if they were to see us, and whatever sort of weird temporal switch, they would think like, wow, these people have no sort of control of hearing or seeing, or just because we're we always have headphones in and there's so much noise in our world. And
yeah, and we're zero connected to the environment, right?
Yeah. So what role did the environment play in these?
You use that to live. I mean, the environment determines your entire life. How long the winter is really important. That determines how much food you have to set aside. But also what time of the day it is. You can tell by looking at your shadow. These are things that people used to know. We don't know these anymore. What phase the moon is in, everything about different weather patterns. That's all existential issues. And there are lots of scientists, monks, studying this stuff in Anglo-Saxon England too. Like the scholar Bede in the 8th century monitored the tides and the moon changes and figured out that the earth is round and that the sun and moon must both be working on the water to pull it, as he says. So yeah, the environment is a huge part of your reality.
Yeah, I think of just like sort of just surviving, just from my probably image that comes from watching all these TV shows, but the survival and the Vikings, exploring and attacking and carrying out invasions is kind of a significant thing, right?
Yeah.
Can we talk? I mean, we've covered a lot of the groups. We've kind of skirted around the kings a little bit, though, the royalty, but they're the center of attention. Do you find that to be deservedly so? Like the statues of the kings and the images we have?
Well, I mean, if we had more documents, it might be easier. Most of what's been written, it comes from a king's court or his entourage. So it's really tough to get away from that.
And what is a king doing? What is a king eating and drinking? What is when the king hears the Vikings are coming, does he grab his sword and go outside?
Well, according to the histories, yes, they sometimes describe that, or Asser talks about Alfred being ferocious, but that's not really what I would imagine. I mean, as a king in the early medieval period, in the Anglo-Saxon world and in the Carolingian world, you'd be itinerant. You've got to be moving around all the time, stopping at your lord's manors to collect taxes or military service, and just moving around all the time. So it's quite a busy life, and you'd be expecting to be to be greeted and have a place to stay all the time, but moving around a lot in between that. And the second that you don't keep this up and you don't do these elaborate gift-giving exchanges that are described really well in Beowulf, if anyone wants to have a listen to that, Seamus Heaney version of it on YouTube that you can listen to, which is an excellent poetic version. Yeah, so this movement and always making sure that your retainers and your thanes are going to obey you is kind of the key to staying alive as a king.
And that was like typically in the human way the goal of life, to stay alive. That's usually a good thing. But were they having fun? Was there like I don't know. I'm trying to humanize the medieval times. Like we make them out to be these kind of, survivalist warlords.
Yeah, with really boring lives and no colors in their clothing, right? And just
where are they sleeping?
So Anglo-Saxons love riddles. They like spoken riddles, but they also like pictures that are like weird, like where are the animals in that? So if you look at any of the stuff that was found in the Sutton Hoo burial, and it's all on the British Museum website in really high quality images, like there's this belt buckle, and depending on from what angles you look and how imaginative you are, you can see a whole bunch of different animals like snakes and birds and boars. And so these things are puzzles that you probably just look at for hours and try to figure out, just like you would tell riddles and try to figure them out. That's where Tolkien got it from for The Hobbit. It's from Anglo-Saxon riddles. And there's a small casket called the Franks Casket, also in the British Museum, and it's essentially a box that's full of riddles. It's got different myths depicted on it, classical history, Christian imagery, runes along the outside, sometimes in a riddle, sometimes giving hints about the images. Sometimes there are a couple of runes that are transliterating Latin. The whole thing is a big puzzle, and then the images have to do with each other if you look at the different sides of the box. So the only way I can imagine that being useful is one night when the sun went down at 4 p.m. because you live in northern England and everything is dark for 6 months of the year.
Oh gosh!
Around a fire, you'd spend hours trying to figure out all the riddles in some of these images and games.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And the more that I'm thinking about this, like the amount of stuff that we could learn. Is this falling a little bit into the sort of noble savage myth, though? Like the sort of like fetishization of medieval culture and like, well, they really understood it and we don't know anything about nature, that kind of thing.
I don't know.
Or were they were good and they knew their stuff?
I don't think that any people you can say are good. There's definitely a lot of bad things that happen there. like slavery, their economy is driven by slavery. So
good. Phew. They had heirs just like us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, okay, I'll stop beating that horse that they are indeed people too. So now we talked about identity formation, and we talked a little bit about language and how it was useful to rhyme and art and things like that. Can we talk a little bit about like this place of literature? So you say like I'm sorry, people are illiterate, but there's got to be storytelling in games like this. What hints do we have from the texts about how people pass these on besides rhymes? Or
Yeah, okay. Well, we have the HoH, that's like a poet singer who would tell poetic stories like Beowulf. So that would take a few hours to relate. And there are a couple sources who describe the role of the HoH. He's a creator. It's a difficult training to learn all the rhymes, as you call them. They're usually alliteration though, and not rhyming.
Man, I can't. This is a hard subject.
Sorry. So they're like the principal storytellers, but I don't think that HoH would be wandering around villages just sort of telling news. I think a lot of it is going to be memorization. And if you look at pretty much any society that doesn't have writing yet, they've got a lot of mnemonic devices. So there's lots of sayings in Old English that we have recorded in the Exeter book, I think. But there's also like ancestry lists that alliterate, and you see that in a bunch of other pre-literate cultures as well. And then there's some of these poems themselves where you can tell when you look at Beowulf that some of it is pre-Christian and some of it is extremely Christian. So that is a text that was changing over time as it was being related, perhaps. Or there's a story called a poem called The Dream of the Rood, which is a dream that the cross has before Jesus is to be crucified on it.
Wow.
The cross tells this story to a person who's dreaming. And he describes how Christ, the warrior, gets onto the cross, and it's a battle, and he's essentially the retainer of Jesus. It's a really interesting poem. It exists in a late 10th century manuscript, but in a slightly different version on a 7th century stone cross as well, written in runes and with very different spelling and some variations. So we know that was being told over and over again over centuries before it was finally recorded. Wow,
that's amazing. Yeah, I'm mostly embarrassed because these kind of things I never crossed their path. Like Beowulf was taught to a lot of people across the world, I think. It used to be part of the sort of classic education or canon. Do you think it has a place in that sort of space now?
I mean, it's interesting, and I think if you have time and interest, then you should totally teach it. It doesn't take very, very long to read. If you get a volume, you can probably do it in 40 minutes, so it's not a huge sap on time or anything.
But would you like advocate or push for it in sort of like a wider university space? Because I've noticed a lot of the first year reading kind of assignments. I don't know if you had one of those as an undergrad, but like mine was a book about an event that had just happened the year before. And from the lists that I've seen, and a historian would say, there's no Herodotus being assigned, or the Peloponnesian War, so should this kind of stuff be assigned? Do you think it's widespread applicable, or are you afraid that would kind of like dilute it?
No, I think it's definitely, it can be applicable to anybody, but that's just because it's good literature, and I don't think you need to read Beowulf to have a full and complete life. Just like you don't need to read any of the rest of the canon. What really matters is that you have a whole bunch of different things so that you have a wider perspective to draw from, right?
Yeah.
Get Beowulf in, then go for it. But if you're busy reading Herodotus, then that's fine too.
Now, do you find yourself... So one thing that I found a lot of historians do is they'll start in one area, and then they'll either become like a global historian, or they'll switch areas as time goes on. It seems like you're firmly entrenched in one area and time period. Do you find yourself because it's a big time period in a big area and complex. Do you find yourself being pulled from subject to subject, like you mentioned runes? Do you get pulled into studying runes for a while, or how does that work?
Well, I was able to dodge that bullet mostly, but there is a translation of The Little Prince that just came out. Well, the Old English came out a few years ago, but now it's in runes. So I got a copy of that, and I'm a whole bunch of hours trying to learn runes better now.
And then the end goal being that you go to some of these places and see some of these runic manuscripts. Is that, I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah, they're usually on stones. Yeah, but I've done that too.
So it is field work as well. So you're mixing really history, literature, there's anthropology in there, material culture, all of these things.
Yeah, but you just have to do it that way. I mean, especially if you look more at the earlier period, I'm starting to look at the 6th and 7th century now, when the kingdoms are just starting to form. When you first have enough wealth and agriculture to even have kingdoms forming, and there are even fewer sources for that period. There's like charters. These are single-page documents that record a land bequest or something, and a couple sets of laws. And there's just not really any other historical documents for the period. But when you're in England or Scandinavia, you can still see the landscapes as they would have seen them or as they created them. Like these burial mounds, a lot of them are still there. And often they're in really important places. When you go to them, then you can see, okay, well, I can see that hill fort way over there, or I can see straight to the Thames or whatever. That's why they chose this site. It's a huge memorial. Like yeah, once I started interacting with the landscape in England, I felt like I had a much better understanding of how an Anglo-Saxon would have lived, but also why are they building this way? How do settlements grow like this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. You have to kind of go and do the field work, maybe more so. Robert Caro said the same thing. He's been working on those Lyndon Johnson biographies, and he's spent his whole life on it, and he's finally getting to the last volume, and people are saying like, all right, dude, come on, because he's like 80 years old or something. But but he's still working on it. And he said, I have to go to Vietnam, even though Johnson, whatever, didn't really go to Vietnam. He went once, but Caro feels like he has to do that. I think that's important for a historian, and it might be lost with people who work on the modern period and just have so many documents.
Yeah, that you never need to even think about these things.
How intense does the thinking about those things kind of go? Like, are we talking like you go to fully experience those England nights? Like, is there camping and those sort of things? Have you ridden on a Viking ship?
No, but I've been to see them. I guess the furthest it goes is because I didn't have a car most of the time when I was living in England, so I'd have to convince unwitting friends that we would go on a road trip together to this hill fort. And some in England, there are lots of like privately held areas that you still have a right of way to walk through, but I wasn't very good at telling that, so I've lost some friendships looking for hill forts being shot at as we accidentally wandered into a hunting range, or
oh jeez,
getting totally lost and eaten by mosquitoes.
And is it hard to convince people to go out and see, like, to the untrained eye, it's just rocks, right?
Yeah.
So that might be a little difficult for a cell too.
Sometimes it works. Sometimes you have a little bit of a wall left, and then even if it doesn't look that impressive, but it's 1400 years old, that's still pretty cool. But yeah, every now and then we get to like a slight hill and there's nothing.
I think you're right, and I've felt that sense in certain places where that's just such a long period of time for something to survive or for something to be there, and to be able to connect with that is kind of extraordinary. People are kind of like looking back, at least this has been a historical theme in the 20th century of these political movements going back and trying to claim the medieval times or earlier for themselves. Like you see it in say like the rise of the Third Reich and things like that. Is this still a problem? Do you see people being attracted to this knowledge for nefarious reasons?
Yeah, it's still a problem. I mean, at its best, it's a form of nationalism, which is exclusionary and a little bit disruptive for society. But at its strongest, it's some of the right-wing nationalists over the past year have been carrying like Crusader symbols, but also Viking symbols, like the Valknot, those three triangles.
Mm-hmm.
They use these symbols to imagine that this means that they are of a pure race or something. I mean, this is completely subverting what the Vikings actually were. They would have been completely mixed ethnically. It doesn't make any sense. It's subverting things from the medieval period to push your own stupid agenda. I don't like that.
No, I imagine you wouldn't. And but it's something that, you know, we kind of notice. I mean, I certainly notice even in like basic things like tattoos and stuff like that, where it's like, oh, this is a really badass Viking symbol that I'm going to have on my forearm or whatever. But I guess these are obviously meaningful symbols. Does some of this arise from the fact that there is so much room for historical interpretation?
I mean, it could, but I'm a little bit more skeptical than that. I think that it's usually people in positions of authority who try to push ideas of identity in order to further their own cause or their group's cause. So for the most part in the modern day, this isn't a problem, right? If somebody gets a Viking tattoo, that's fine. Get a Viking tattoo, get whatever, anything you want. It's when you instrumentalize it to show that your group is better than another group that...
And take it and weaponize it, right?
Yeah.
As far as the historical interpretation goes, I would be interested to know, since I haven't, studied the historiography of this, what do you come across when you read, say, like a 19th century English historian? You said a lot of your work comes from the German historians. Are their interpretations pretty close to what we have now?
Well, they're quite a bit different. I mean, part of a really important thing in German historiography is that after the Second World War, they had to be really critical about saying, oh, Germany extends back to Arminius or whoever. And they really question nationalism, and that shows up in their historical writing. And that hasn't happened in other places. So a lot of late 19th century, but also a lot of 20th century historical literature about the Anglo-Saxon world tries to create an England that was born probably in King Alfred's reign and exists until the present day. And there's a lot of tradition for that in the 16th century, supporting Henry VIII's break from the church. People were looking up these old manuscripts to show, oh yes, the Anglo-Saxons were always a special or different church. This is a long, unbroken heritage that goes back to this period. So you see that as well in the 19th and 20th centuries, that historians are trying to see creation of England as something that's inevitable. West Saxon conquests of neighboring territories are often depicted as reconquests, like we saved you from the Vikings, even though you never actually belonged to us in the first place. So there's some uncritical history writing in that sense. It's definitely changed in the past 20 years. People are a little bit more critical about this idea of England, and it certainly didn't start with, or it wasn't fully formed with Alfred, but even 50 years ago, there were still people proclaiming that Alfred created Oxford University and created the English Navy, which has existed unbroken until today, and created the Standing Army, and was the first king of England to create law codes. And I mean, all of that stuff is based on bits of truth. Like, he did have a bunch of ships built, but that wasn't the Navy. I don't know. So this is all a little tricky.
Yeah, it is. It is very tricky. And I think that's a fascinating point that you bring up about the Germans having to look back at their history critically. And it's something that, especially where we see the rise of these, extreme ideologies, are in places where history was always taught in one way. Like in the most recent example that comes to my mind is just recently in Cuba, they had the slogan of the Office of the Historian is "Have faith in your history," as if it's like, it's dogma, and that's really dangerous for societies. So this is important. I mean, I don't think there's any way that you can better sort of sell the importance of medieval history and historians.
Then I teach this to my students, right? And I don't know what their political background is, but I know that I have a good mix in the room. So I don't want to start any fires by talking about contemporary politics. And I can totally avoid that by talking about strategies that were used in the medieval period that are still being used today. And the students are much more able to look at that critically because it's so far removed and not threatening at all to themselves. And then they can think about, okay, yeah, this is something that a state does in order to create an identity group so that people do support the rulers.
Yeah. And I find it's also helpful that in the fact that you are able to have an expertise over hundreds of years, you can, it really throws into relief some of the changes and some of history is bigger. Whereas, sometimes we get so minuscule and as modern historians that it seems like 5 years is a long time.
Yeah.
Whereas with medieval, I mean, how long do these wars last between the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons?
Well, most of the wars are just isolated battles, and because Vikings, they form armies and then they dissolve and then they reform and then they're shifting. It's not really like, for the most part, it's not a huge amount of steady warfare, especially not until the end of the 8th century. Then you get battles, but they only last a day as well.
But are they, and they're just classified as battles, or are they kind of lumped together in the telling of history?
That really depends on what that historian feels like writing. Like if there were 7 battles or 9 battles fought in that year, then you might say there were 9 battles, so people would know it was important that the king was able to bring the Vikings to battle 9 times, because usually they run away. Or if there were only 3 wins, then you might only bring up those ones. I mean, I guess that's sort of the fun part or the difficult part at looking at these sources. What are they leaving out? There's so much left out that it's deliberate what they've chosen to include and what they've chosen to leave out. Sorry, I'm deviating from your question.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's interesting. So you have to read against the grain, and then you have to sort of at the same time you have to put it into present day language to a certain extent, which is in itself kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's why I try not to use words like nationalism and propaganda. Even though I think it's the same processes. It's just difficult to describe it that way.
So when all you medievalists get together, do you talk to each other in Old English?
I have only a very few weird friends who will do that with me.
I figured as much. So it's not a dead language. I expect to see it on Duolingo anytime soon.
I mean, it's coming. It's on Wikipedia.
Is it really?
Yeah, you can read articles in Old English.
Well, and then that's the start. Like you said, you just kind of start with things, but a lot of it is aloud, right? You would read them aloud?
I have to read out loud, but that's because Old English, if you look at the words, they look confusing, but if you say them aloud, then you can sometimes hear what they turn into. Your chances of understanding it are a lot better if you speak it.
Yeah. I think it's good advice. The pre-Duolingo stage where you can just read books and learn a language. Fantastic. Great. Well, we're getting close to the end of the hour, so that's the time for suggestions. I know you've already thrown in some excellent suggestions with the reading of Beowulf on YouTube, and we'll link to that. But do you have another specific, and you also mentioned the British Library. Do you have another specific sort of suggestion for the audience who's into this kind of stuff?
So I would suggest taking a look at Scan the World. Right now in medieval studies, there's, well, I guess everywhere, there's all these digital humanities that are developing, and the ability to create 3D models of anything is, of course, fantastic for all of us, but it's especially good for early medievalists, because if you can show someone the jewelry or let them hold it, or whatever device, a stone, any of these things, then the history comes to life when they're touching that. At Scan the World, a whole bunch of people, not just academics, are scanning objects at museums and then uploading 3D models. So you can look at them online or you can print them out yourself. And it's a really fun way of interacting with actual medieval artifacts. Wow, that is very cool. Yeah, there are lots of sites doing that. That's just one of the ones that I'm following on Twitter right now.
Awesome. That'll be an excellent sort of thing to keep an eye out on the future. I would imagine the medievalists are going to sort of lead the way in that, just because it's always kind of the most captivating stuff at museums too. Like you mentioned those coins. I've always found the coins fascinating. My suggestion is World Digital Libraries, put on by the Library of Congress, which it has a fantastic collection of manuscripts that you can view, but not only just view the sort of like the documents, but it also maps them out really nicely. So you know right exactly where they found this manuscript and where the Anglo-Saxons were and so on. So that's great.
That looks really fun.
Yeah, World Digital Libraries. And since it's the Library of Congress, it will stay open whether or not government is open in the United States because it's run by Congress. So, so there's always that. Well, this has been, I feel very humbled at the end of this Hour of History podcast because this is a hard subject and I learned a lot. And I'm much less intimidated now. So is there anything else that I should have asked or something that you want to promote or say?
No, but I think you did a really good job preparing.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope everyone on listening enjoyed this, and I hope you will check out these links. I know I'm going to give Beowulf a shot after this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Konshuh. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. Enjoy Beowulf.
All right. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.
Hey, Hour of History podcast fans, have you checked out the Hour of History blog, hourofhistory.com/blog, updated twice a month with new content talking about the trials and tribulations of becoming a historian, as well as some great suggestions for books, movies, and just about everything else under the sun. hourofhistory.com/blog. Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.